at the bottom end of the distribution. I think one of the kind of real challenges is to deal with exceptionally high incomes at the top of the income distribution, and we're starting to kind of debate those issues in South Africa. Just a last point about the nature of this transformation. I think for thousands of years, kind of unpaid work that we do to sort of care for each other, and it's a sort of distribution of work that has a fundamentally kind of segmented nature, in that it's seen as kind of work that is essentially the burden of females. My sense is we might well see the kind of value of work that is care work going up. That work that is sort of done with empathy might well sort of get the true economic value that it deserves. And I think the types of kind of interesting kind of social transformations that might kind of engender, and the fundamental change in the kind of in the gendered kind of distribution of work is something that is really, really important as well. I had a few more slides, but I've sort of got to the end of my time. They were just kind of really just expanding on these ideas, so I kind of think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Valodia, for actually laying out and disentangling the challenges for developed and developing countries and raising the issue of the structural transformation. Also, you know, how it was important how you went about deconstructing the various technologies that are driving the fourth industrial revolution, because very often the debate tends to take technological change as an exogenous force. And when we're having this discussion, we do need to endogenize that and understand what are the drivers of these technological changes. So I'd now like to turn to Professor Nagaraj.
Thank you, Chair. I must thank ICRIER for this kind invitation. This is my first appearance in G20 meetings, and what I'm saying may not gel well with the audience, so probably it will be my last visit as well for this meeting. Okay. Future of work. What's work? I mean, saying work for wages, income, or material reward. It's a market-based monetary compensation for efforts as wage worker, self-employed own-account worker, or employer. That's one kind of, when you say work. Other is non-wage work for looking after family, the care economy. I think my previous speaker spoke about the care economy. Okay, and non-wage work for community, society, and polity. Okay. We are concerned in this presentation with the former, with the first, the wage work, or the work for material reward. Right? The context. The context, I think, is very clear. I think the original slide said fourth industrial revolution. I think that's the context. Yeah, the threat of automation, artificial intelligence, robotics, other things I did not mention, big data, 4D, 3D printing, all that I did not mention. Replacing workers with machines and software. That's the concern we have. The current wave of technologies have the potential to alter the ways in which human beings work in the workplace, potentially devastating work as we know. I think Mr. Sanyal in the morning did mention about this. Okay. Any technical progress is a threat and an opportunity. I mean, I don't have to say this is very obvious. Hence the question is how to prepare to cope with the potential threat. I mean, of course, we can enjoy the benefits of the productivity gain that we'll. Okay. So goals of future of work, as with any issue with work, I start with the standard Keynesian view, look, objective is to attain full employment with macroeconomic stability and an orderly global trade and financial flows. I think that goes well with the G20 objectives. Okay. However, the challenges faced by developed and less developed countries could be very different. This is this point of departure. I make a distinction between this. Of course, one can bring in the emerging market economies. I don't want to do that. I'll pick it much more starkly, two set of countries, developed, underdeveloped. This is an old-fashioned categorization, which I still think is very valuable. Okay. Considering the wide gap in the levels of development and widely differing economic structures, I take what I would call a structuralist view of the world. Okay. Goals of development is to attain a steady rise in per capita income with structural transformation. This is something we often forget. I think these words have become less common in economic discourse these days. Structural transformation, I'm referring to Kuznets' idea. Okay. Need for a differentiated view to get a more realistic understanding of challenges of meeting the future of work goals. Excuse me. Okay, what happened? Sorry, I think something going on with me. Sorry, I'll have to read it out. Hope the next slide is okay. Okay, this slide is better. Yeah.
Technology fighting back.
No, this is just the transcribing problem.
This is our next slide. Which is this next slide?
This is this slide, analytical view. Analytical view, right? This view, this slide 5 has got slightly.
Threatening is about to be told.
Okay. I just say, this is simple analytical ideas to start with. This is where I would like to hang my arguments together. Is per capita income, which is what we are all bothered about, is a product of labor force participation rate and labor productivity. Okay. In LDCs, in less developed countries, labor productivity in manufacturing and services is 4 to 5 times that of agriculture. This is again a matter of fact. Okay. Hence, one of the biggest gains in in productivity and hence increase in income comes from transforming workers from agriculture to non-agriculture. Okay. This shift itself will give substantial increase in labor productivity. Average labor productivity in agriculture in LDCs is a small fraction of that in the advanced countries. Okay, hence scope for labor productivity in agriculture will reduce disguised unemployed immensely. If we can increase labor productivity by employing the disguised unemployed better, will itself lead to a huge increase in productivity. Okay, so this is I think we must keep in mind. These are the basic issues in transforming agriculture or labor in less developed countries and to increase their productivity. Okay, global labor composition. World population is about 7.6 billion. 18% of it is in developed countries. Okay, about 20 to 22% in global labor force. Due to higher labor force participation rates, including of women. This is again a well-known fact. Most of the workers in advanced countries work for wage labor, open unemployment with wide variations across countries, within advanced countries. Okay? Developed countries are post-industrial societies, with most of their output and employment coming from services. Again, well-known facts. Okay? Workers have social security benefits to maintain a minimum standard of living throughout their life. Okay. Labor force in LDCs are still substantially rural, agrarian, and informal, though services account for a somewhat higher share in the GDP. Okay. So if we are bothered about future of work, we must think about labor market. Okay. Disguised unemployment with considerable self-employment using household labor is still substantial in developing countries. Okay. Widespread low female participation rate, child labor is still prevalent in many countries. India has the largest child labor stock in the world. Okay. This is just a basic picture of a table giving on this distribution of labor force This is an unweighted average. This is an unweighted average. So it shows that in world as a whole, about 30% of workers are in agriculture. This is unweighted. If you wait for the size of the countries, it will go up to 40 to 45. Okay. So and services about will correspondingly will go down. Okay. Fine. Caveats: the figures are unweighted country averages. Adjusting for population size, agricultural share will go up substantially. Okay. Agriculture still has the largest share in LDCs. Low productive agriculture and in informal sector to industry and services account for majority of workers. LDCs are still undergoing Kuznets-ian structural transformation. Okay, and the speed of which is very slow. In fact, is been affected badly. Lewisian turning point is still quite far away. Lewisian turning point is a term used in development economics. It says that when the percentage of labor force in agriculture reduces below 50%, okay, it has crossed the Lewisian turning point. It is turned to a more developed country. Okay, even that turning point has not been reached by majority of LDCs. Okay, yet this is an important point again. Yet many LDCs in Africa and Latin America have witnessed premature deindustrialization. This is a concept I need to explain a little bit. See, globally, the industrialization progressed. Manufacturing output share in total increased steadily. Correspondingly, the labor share in manufacturing also went up. But after they reached a certain maturity, there was a deindustrialization. This happened in UK in 60s and 60s and 70s, and whole developed countries have today become post-industrial societies. So deindustrialization in advanced countries happened after reaching a certain level of maturity, after reaching a certain level of per capita income. But what we have witnessed in developing countries in the last 2 or 3 decades is that even before reaching that maturity, in many countries, the share of labor in manufacturing has started to decline. And this is what scholars like Danny Roderick or Bob Rothon have called it premature deindustrialization. Yeah, I'll explain. Yeah. Definition: decline in the share of industry in manufacturing and GDP or total workforce before a country attaining its industrial maturity. Tendency is mostly observed in Latin America and Africa in post-liberalization period, that is since 1980s. Proponents of these views are Danny Roderick, Bob Rothon. Okay, I have termed in this Indian context, I call it industrial stagnation. Okay, right. Implications of this is slowdown in Kuznets-ian structural transformation of workforce from low productive primary to higher productive non-farm sector. Historically, manufacturing was the engine of growth because of positive externalities to rest of the economy and productivity spillovers. This is an important point. Why is manufacturing emphasized in development literature? Okay, is because manufacturing sector has enormous positive spillovers to rest of the economy in terms of productivity. Okay, and this is what economists call Verdun's law, following Verdun's law. This transformation is got thwarted in India because of premature deindustrialization. Okay, and this is the reason why labor productivity in developing countries continues to be very low, and the process of transformation has got stopped. Okay, Indian evidence. This is you have 2 graphs there, 2 lines. One is the orange line shows the share of manufacturing in GDP, and the red line shows the share of manufacturing labor force in total labor force. You can see it has barely increased over 70s to 2000s. Okay, and this is more about labor. This is data taken from the census data. You see, between 91 and if you take 91 and 2011, the share of manufacturing labor in total labor has in fact stagnated. Okay, and this is what we are concerned about: industrial stagnation or deindustrialization. Okay, unless we go through this process, I think we are missing out on probably the biggest technology or productivity gains which the whole country can get. Okay, that's organization of another point. Organization of manufacturing. Historically, within manufacturing, okay, manufacturing moved from household enterprises to small workshops and eventually to factory farm production. This is a historical process. Why does it happen? Because the more latter forms of organizations have more productivity. As okay, the evolution is on account of technological superiority of factory farm and changing labor market condition, that is exhaustion of surplus labor. We have not exhausted our surplus labor. We still have a huge surplus labor which is still stuck at the lowest level of levels of production. Okay, and this is the picture taken from an economics paper. This is a classic. You see the household as labor productivity goes up, or the surplus labor declines. The household employment goes down. Then small factories and workshops go up and they decline, and eventually the factory farm picks up. This is how historically manufacturing has gone about. In India, even this process, and not in India, I'm taking as an example, probably this is true of much of Africa and much of Asia, where this transformation has still not happened adequately. Okay, I'll give you an example here. Okay, in India, you can see there are 4 lines. I'll just speak about 2 lines. Okay, you see that the household manufacturing, the first line, you see it was around in 1961. It was about 55%. Even today, it's about 30%. It has not just declined as we saw in the previous graph. Okay. Similarly, you can see that the factory manufacturing, factory employment share in total manufacturing employment has just remained about 30%. So even the productivity increase which happens from moving from household manufacturing to factory manufacturing has not happened in India. So see, that is the weight of surplus labor which is holding back the productivity gains. So for a developing country, the biggest gains of productivity has to happen here. Okay, that's the point. Okay, implications. Traditionally, low productive forms of industrial production have persisted in LDCs as they represent survival strategies. Because you have surplus labor, you have no other employment opportunities. So you hang on to your household manufacturing, make vada pavs or whatever on the street just to survive. Okay, they are survival strategies. And this is what represents the lowest level of productivity in non-agriculture. Okay? One suspects this is true of other countries as well that have witnessed deindustrialization. Okay? While this may help subsistence poor, they are holding back productivity gains. Because why are we talking about the fourth industrial revolution? Because we say that we want to grab the opportunities of getting the productivity gains. Yes, we can get it, but we are at a very different level right now. Not when I say we, I am talking about the LDCs. Okay, so biggest gains have to come from here. Okay. So how do we get it? Again, we find in the last 2-3 decades. Last 2-3 decades, okay, when we have experienced deindustrialization, we have practically given up industrial policy. The countries which have within the framework of a globalized economy, within the framework of market-oriented economies, Asian economies which have carefully crafted their industrial policies have persisted with industrialization. But whereas Latin America and Africa, which practically gave up those policies, found that they have got deindustrialized. Okay, so there's a need for reconfiguring or reimagining industrial policies so that we get back to the process of industrialization and again get the advantages of structural transformation. Okay, it should aim at meeting domestic demand to begin with and at creating dynamic competitive advantage in the long run. It seems very true in the immediate goal of trade conflict in the context of present trade conflict which we are finding today. I think this makes a lot of sense. G20 could commit to promote domestic market-led industrialization to support skill development for low and medium skill industries. Okay, this is important. again, such a demand for skills are likely to be very different from those required in the post-industrial societies in the wake of threat of automation. This is again a distinction I would like to make. I know in the whole discussion on the fourth industrial revolution, they're talking about reskilling workers, but that's of a different order of magnitude, different kind of things. What we are asking for is a much lower level, and I think that is what is required for developing countries. Okay, so this is the point. Okay, automation threat. Yes, in DC's future of work being discussed in the context of automation threat. Its seriousness is being widely debated and contested. This is important. Okay, income effect of automation may exceed the substitution effect. In fact, Dr. Kapoor has a paper she's written for G20 Secretariat where she has brought out a good summary of the literature, which shows, look, if the automation comes in, the income effect, in the sense that as the automation comes in, it may in fact expand the demand rather than substitution effect of displacement of labor. In LDCs, given very low wages, how much robots and artificial intelligence can substitute labor is an open question. Analysis of world robotics census shows threat of labor displacement is probably overdone. Recent studies show, I have two studies in my mind. One is the OECD study, one is a study by Dr. Sunil Mani of Trivandrum, that their use. See, there's a problem with how you capture the effect of robots. Okay, the usual data used is occupational characteristics, occupational distribution of wages. Instead of it, if you take skill-based, what you call the then you find you get a much task-based. If you get a task-based distribution of workforce, you probably get a much different picture. Okay, so I think I'm not saying that we should not get gains of productivity, of automation, nor we should be unconcerned about the displacement effect of newer technologies. But what we should keep in mind is, look, some of it is probably overdone. One has to be cautious about the headlines we hear, we read. Okay, in sum, apocalyptic popular discourse on artificial intelligence, robotics need to be tempered with reasoned discussion on income and substitution effects of the technological change and costs and benefits of investments in LDCs with very low wage rates. Okay? G20's future of work needs to speak for workers of the global south, constituting nearly 80% of the global labor force. Surely, automation can significantly augment productivity if used judiciously. Okay? However, for LDCs, significant gains remained untapped from improving agricultural land and a rural economy, given the low levels of development. Structural transformation, like Kuznets, is sine qua non of development, which has got stunted due to premature deindustrialization. This needs to be reversed to improve labor productivity and equity. Okay? G20 could highlight the urgency of reconfiguring the active industrial policy for promoting non-farm employment. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagaraj. And now we turn to Dr. Sanjeev Sanyal.
Good afternoon, friends, and good to be back in the afternoon to speak about one of my pet subjects, the future of work. And I will be speaking not just as a policymaker and principal economic advisor to the government of India. As you can imagine, this is obviously an issue that pops up in our head all the time, but also as co-chair of the FWG group of G20, which has been given the task of, in fact, looking into this specific topic. So I have been at multiple levels, both at the national and international level, at the sort of intersection of the debate on this topic. However, as you will shortly discover, I have somewhat heretical views on the matter, because although I'm an economist, I have a healthy disdain for monetarism, Keynesianism, Kuznetsism, Fabian socialism, and so on. I happen to come from a completely different school of economics, which is a chaos theory and complexity theory economics. So I'm much more close to the Austrians than maybe many of the economists you're used to listening to. So I am a person who deals with butterfly effects, unintended consequences, and I'm extremely skeptical about the human ability to predict where this is all going. So let me tell you a little bit of a story, which will give you a flavor of how I think about policy making in an era of radical uncertainty. Let me see how many of you have dogs. So how many, let me see. Lift your, okay, there's a few gentlemen here who've got dogs. And I'm sure some of you take your dogs, or have at least seen others who have dogs, and take them to the park and throw a frisbee. And you throw a frisbee, and most dogs will have little difficulty running along and grabbing the frisbee. But most traditional economists will not do this. What the traditional economist will do, whether monetarist, Keynesian, or otherwise, is first they will go to the park and measure the speed of the wind. Then they will do a long study and a paper on the breed of the dog. Then they will study the angle at which they will throw it, study of their muscle strength. They will study the shape of the frisbee, and they will put it all into a computable general equilibrium model, which will give them a forecast. And if they are conscientious policymakers, they will give this to a frisbee policy committee, which will give them forward guidance. And on the basis of the forward guidance, they will take the dog to the park, put a stake in the ground, tie the dog to it, and throw the frisbee. And 99% of the time, the dog will not be able to catch the frisbee because the frisbee will land somewhere else. And the only person who will be surprised by this is, of course, the economist, who will then pursue in the next 3 months to issue a thick report with charts and graphs and lots of equations to explain why that forecast went wrong. Meanwhile, of course, most normal people are throwing their frisbee and their dog is catching the frisbee. So the question is, how is the dog able to catch the frisbee? The way the dog catches the frisbee is not by forecasting where the frisbee will go. What happens is that the owner generally indicates in which direction it may go, but it's a very broad general direction, and then throws the frisbee. And the dog runs along, looks at the frisbee, adjusts. Then runs along, looks at the frisbee, adjusts. And the very last minute, it locks in, jumps, grabs the frisbee. So what is the non-economist dog doing to catch the frisbee? What it is doing is feedback loop and adjust. This is about flexible and real-time adjustment to evolving situation. This is not about the great ability to make PowerPoint presentations and Excel sheet forecasts about where the world will go. And there is a serious lesson in this. The reason I'm saying this is because, frankly, we are going indeed through major technological changes, but I have some problem with great forecasts made about how many jobs will be lost, about where exactly the jobs will be created, and so on and so forth. The answer, the real truth is, we do not know. So how do we make policy in an environment where we do not know? And for that, we can do 2 or 3 things. One is, think about the kinds of adjustments we can make. And two, think much more deeply about the longer history of technological change. And try and see, yes, there's some things to be learned from history, but you cannot take this from just looking at the last few years. We have to take a much, much longer views of history to be able to gauge any patterns at all. As Mark Twain used to say, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So now, one of the repeated things that are talked about in the case of technology is the fact that you'll have all this technology and that, in fact, the unskilled are going to be essentially wiped out of this equation and the highly skilled will benefit, which then is said that we should therefore invest in a large amount of skilling. Now, let me show you how there are serious problems with this entire line of thought. First of all, it is not obvious at all that through the history of technological change, it was always the unskilled who got hurt by technological changes. And it's certainly not the case now, but it was not even true in the first industrial revolution. So let's go back to the first industrial revolution. This is the late 18th century. The most skilled workers in the world are Indian. What do? They make textiles. Technological shift happens in Britain. They figure out how to make cloth out of cotton using steam-powered machines. But who benefits from this? Who are the workers? The workers who benefit from this are not high-skilled workers, but in fact, the high-skilled workers in the textile industry at that time were Indian. They were highly skilled artisans making absolutely top-end textiles, which were exporting to the world. And contrary to popular belief, the East India Company was mostly trading in cotton at the end of the 18th century and not in spices. Of course, it's a different matter. They would move on to trading in opium later on. So now, what happens with the first industrial revolution? What happens is that mill owners in Britain, in northern Britain in particular, but generally in Britain, deploy unskilled workers who are being thrown out by the enclosure movement in Britain. These are completely unskilled, and they get deployed into these cotton mills to produce cloth. So who were the beneficiaries from this? Unskilled workers being thrown out by the enclosure movement. Who were those who got hurt most by it? It was Indian skilled artisanal workers. So if I had been using conventional thinking in the 18th century, I would have said, oh my God, we are going to have new technology, it's going to compete with us. Let us invest in making our artisans even more skilled than they already are. Totally wrong idea. That whole line of thought was about to go out of the window. So this is an important thing. This is true even today. Take, for example, Google Maps. If you went to London, the London cabbie is a highly skilled person. It takes 3 years of hard work to become a London cabbie. What is his skill? Basically being able to do what any of us can do on our phone, which is Google Maps. His high skill has just got wiped out. Anybody who is a reasonable driver with access to Google Maps can now essentially do what this highly skilled London cabbie could do. So he has been made irrelevant. And indeed, this is what is happening with a lot of artificial intelligence and many of the technologies we talked about. This is not wiping out people at the bottom necessarily. It could. But a lot of the jobs that are getting wiped out, like, for example, mid-level legal work. As I told you in the morning, artificial intelligence is now able to play chess. It's able to produce music. Clearly, being a chess grandmaster or being a music maker is a high skill activity. You've just been disintermediated. So this is an important thing to understand out of this. We are in a nonlinear world where large numbers of jobs will be created and a large numbers of jobs will be destroyed. But anybody who has got a linear view that good for skilled, bad for unskilled, hasn't any idea about the history of technology and its impact. Highly nonlinear. In fact, the most important thing to learn from this history is that, one, you have to imbibe this technology quickly, and two, you have to have an ability to respond flexibly, and this is very important. Flexibility matters a lot more than the ability to forecast where all of this is going. The dog's ability to forecast was 0, but it flexibly adjusted quickly. So speed of response matters a lot more than either your initial starting point or your ability to tell where this is all going. So this is very, very important. And this will be true of all kinds of things, whether we think about labor flexibility, the flexibility of our education system, the flexibility of our corporate sector. And so, for example, insolvency and bankruptcy is a far more important reform in this environment of creative destruction than all the industrial policies that we may want to have. Now, this is not, however, a case for not having industrial policy, but of a very different kind. And so while I do agree with Professor Nagaraj, we need industrial policies, the reason you need industrial policies is very, very different. This is not an environment where you think of industrial policy as in, we are a poor country, we have Heckscher-Ohlin type graph, poor country, cheap labor, hence we specialize in high labor intensity goods. No. In the world of complexity, what happens is the places where you develop capability are areas where you create clusters. Those of you who know complexity theory will know about strange attractors. There's no particular reason why a strange attractor suddenly creates a virtuous circle. But once that virtuous cycle takes off, and very often these virtuous cycles happen because of some small initial advantage, sometimes artificially created through industrial policy. But once it gathers a certain momentum of its own, it then begins to become a comparative advantage, even if your initial conditions were entirely against you. So this is how we ended up with Bangalore becoming a major hub for software and startups in the IT sector. It started up because it had a small initial advantage because ISRO, HAL, etc. were there. There were a small cluster there, and it sort of grew upon itself. There was a strange attractor there. Now, if we had gone back and had decided ex ante in 1990 to try and predict that India one day would be an IT hub, we would never have started, because in 1990, we didn't have anything to do with, we didn't have a hub. Using static analysis of any kind, we would have had an industrial policy that would have only been interested in pushing for the textile industry or garments manufacturing. The problem is that the world is entirely nonlinear. China may have very initially started in garments manufacturing, but its industrial policy very quickly began to protect and promote all kinds of new things. And already it is moved into, in fact, is after America, probably the leading cutting-edge innovator in things, many of the things, cutting-edge technologies we're talking about. But even today, despite the fact that it has made such a lot of progress, if you went by static analysis, looked at wages, looked at its education level, and many other development criteria, it is still a middle-income developing country and shouldn't be going into all these areas. But its industrial policy has deliberately gone into these areas. So industrial policy matters. It matters because clustering matters. And basically, in the environment that I have talked about, we need to therefore think about industrial policy, but we do not need to think about it in the traditional povertarian mindset that, oh, we are a poor country, therefore we cannot send satellites to space. It turns out we can. And this is the kind of thinking we need to now spread it into all kinds of other areas. Same thing is true for education. We'll repeatedly be told, we must have more education, but education to do what? There is a large numbers of jobs that are now being created, say, in social media. All kinds of things are being done in social media, whether it's media-related, advertising, Cambridge Analytica tells us that there's, we can use that for big, all kinds of political campaigning. There's all kinds of big data things that can be done. These are completely new jobs. But if you told me 15 years ago to prepare for this, I simply wouldn't know what to do with it. So the point I'm making is, it is all very good to say we must prepare for this by educating more, but doing what? So I would argue there are 2 or 3 things we need to do. One is to look at trends and respond fast, which means our education system, beyond the basic education, which everybody needs to know the multiplication tables, but beyond that, we need to have an attitude towards education which is much more attuned and much more flexible than it is today. This is not about digging ever deeper depth into silos, but about opening them up and allowing for much greater variety of things to be done at the local level with, by the way, something that our education establishment dislikes, with very close links with industry. Historically, with the exception of a few engineering colleges, our education establishment has had a general disdain for links with industry. This has got to be changed. This is a very important thing. But there are many other things we need to rearrange. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples before I stop, and we can discuss these. let's think about how we set up our education system at all. The way we set it up today is with the view that an individual will finish high school at 18, and then for 3, 4 years, 5 years, depending on how much education they do, they'll go to university. And then having finished by the age of 25, they will then apply this, whatever skill they adopted for the next 45-odd years in their workplace. Now, this way of arranging your education system feeds through to everything that we do. For example, the way we build our universities. We build our universities as walled-off campuses on 700 acres in middle of nowhere. The idea is that you will do some, go off, study in a in-house university, study for 4 years, and then leave. That is a completely wrong way of thinking about education in an environment which is rapidly evolving, as you can see. Because just when you reach the highest levels of decision making when you're in your 50s, early 60s, you are the most outdated person in the entire system. So, in an environment of rapid technological change, you need to have set up the whole thing for repeatedly lifelong education. But look at how we have set up our universities in places where you cannot do lifelong education because you have deliberately separated out the education from everyday life by separating them, putting them away. Whereas in fact, the next generation of universities have to be built in situ, where people naturally as a course of their lives keep going back in and out of universities, where these universities similarly have direct and close links with industry and generally society at large, so that this is a evolving ecosystem with feedback loops of all kinds. And so this requires us, as I said, a completely different way of thinking about our education system. No amount of deepening today's curriculum is going to solve the problem. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanyal, for giving us that historical perspective. But I can't help wondering that, through your talk, you were underlining the unpredictability of what we're calling the fourth industrial revolution. So I wonder to what extent history can really guide us in the future. But we'll have that discussion. Okay. We anyway started 10 minutes late. I'd like to just open the floor first. We'll take a round of questions. So if you could please briefly introduce yourself and who the question is directed to, and in the interest of the time, if we could just restrict ourselves to questions and not comments. Thank you.
Alok Shil. I'm a former civil servant, and the question is for Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal for first a very interesting talk, I must say. And I want to just go back to your example of the first industrial revolution. And the point you made was that it is not a critique of reskilling, that it is not necessarily the unskilled workers who lose, but the skilled workers. And you gave the example, it can be, but you gave the example of the Industrial Revolution, where it is the unskilled, people thrown out from the enclosure, through the enclosure movement. But when they go into a factory, you have to get skilled. So it is not as though they were not skilled, but they had a different skill compared to the traditional workers. And coming back to the fourth industrial revolution, when you have all these technological changes, those so-called people who would be employed in the technology of the future, they would need much higher levels of skills than those thrown off the land. And for that, there has been a concern with growing inequalities and the lack of provision of public goods. And you would have, the people who are excluded, may not be able to acquire those level of skill and education to get employed. Okay.
We'll take 4 questions to begin with.
M.C. Verma. I was also at ICRIER for about 6 years, and I worked for ILO. The question I'm asking is with reference to what the ILO has been thinking recently. They have used a phrase called active labor market policies. Apparently, that phrase takes note of the responses which are required from the labor or from the human capital to the varied circumstances which have occurred. And this happened about a dozen years back. Now, what I want to know is whether the government of India, in any form, has taken serious note of what is required in terms of following the active labor market policies.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll take these three and then three more. Otherwise you'll forget me. Okay.
Yeah, so a good question. And in fact, the reason I made that point was, in fact, to take away from some misconceptions about what happened in the first industrial revolution, which you refer to. The Indian workers of that time were highly skilled. Being a highly skilled artisan takes years of practice. Those who were being deployed in the British factories were in fact low skilled. They did require some skilling, but it required just a few years of skilling. And in fact, many of these workers were only 12, 13-year-old boys, as you will know from reading Charles Dickens. So they were not high technology. All they were what the Industrial Revolution did was, one is, of course, it motorized things, but it also meant that the factory floor was divided into these extremely simple tasks. So since you had, instead of a weaver who had to know how to design, he had to know how to bleach his thing, he had to then make the cloth, then he probably had to market his cloth as well. What the Industrial Revolution did is it broke down the production process into extremely simple steps. And so each individual worker, true, had to be trained a little bit, but usually had to do nothing much more than tighten a screw. Charlie Chaplin's Modern Age also talks about that. So it was actually a bonanza for the deployment of relatively low-skilled workers, interestingly. So this is the point I'm making, is that it is different skills, but not necessarily higher skills. It could be higher skills. Clearly, certain types of higher skills were needed for those, for example, who were producing the machines themselves. They had to be a certain higher skill. But the bulk of the workers were not higher skill. And by the way, this is also true of the technology of warfare. When the initial guns came to be used, they were actually far less accurate than bows and arrows. The reason people moved from bows and arrows to guns was not that the guns were better, they were actually worse. What the real benefit of the guns initially was simply that being able to be a good archer required years of practice. A gunner could be trained in just 3 weeks. So this is an important part of it. Much of technology is about allowing low-skilled people to do high-skilled things, while the very top end, a few people will make a lot of money because they have done, they are creating these technologies, they'll make a lot of money. But the bulk application of it is actually about allowing low-skill people to do high-skill things. I mean, after all, the average person with a smartphone can now do things that 20 years ago only a very high-skilled person could do, which is to take photographs, do a film, chat with friends around the world. This was an elite activity till very recently. Technology has allowed the average person in the interior of India to be able to do a video conference. So this idea that technology is only upward moving is not true. The main benefit of technology, and which is the reason that many countries, particularly very recently in East Asia, were able to rapidly jump up the technology technology frontier, was precisely to take cognizance of this issue and be able to do it. So what they did is they ignored usual economists' view that it was a ladder that needed to be climbed. It isn't. You can hop, skip, and jump very, very quickly up it. It requires a certain kind of industrial policy, however, but it is not the kind of industrial policy that historically non-East Asian economists have told us about. It is a very different kind of, and I can get into that, but it's about creating clusters, being willing to invest into certain technologies, taking a few bets where you feel that may work out, with the willingness to understand that some of them will go wrong, and so on. So this is about, ultimately, flexibility. It is not our ability to predict the future that matters.
So we'll just take another round of questions. Yeah.
There were other questions.
Thank
They
you.
said they'll answer in the end because there's just one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, Dr. Sanyal has been stressing this business about flexibility in policy making. And I think in the context, which is the G20, in which we are discussing the future of job creation, I find that a bit disconcerting. The last time we allowed sovereigns flexibility in framing their own policies was in the Paris Agreement for Climate Change. And that is an unqualified disaster. Why do we think that regulating 20 or more sovereigns with a flexible policy is going to end up being any better?
Go ahead, please.
I'm Dr. Kshamta from Amity University. After listening to the dignitaries, a fear comes in the mind that to be relevant forever, because every new time we are becoming obsolete in terms of skills whenever there is a new technological change comes. Industry is bringing revolution, government is making policy for structural changes, but academia also has equal responsibility because we are the supplier of skill and talent to industry. Now, in the existing education system, what are your suggestions, Dr. Sanyal, so that we can ensure that our next generation is ready for this challenge? How can we bring these swift and, as you said, quick changes in our education system so that we and our next generation is ready for this challenge?
Thank you. And there's just one final question.
Yeah. I will add an addendum to what Dr. Sanyal has mentioned about flexibility. So far, the just-in-time processing was the main strength of value chain formation. But given the changes, the very drastic global changes, both strategic and climatic, I think the philosophy should be just in case. So you may have several sources to think on. If one fails, the other can work.
Could I request all the panelists to respond briefly? Okay.
Okay, thank you. No, I think there's only one. There was one question, the Indonesian scholar. No, I agree. When we require industrial policy, which you are given, and But at what level you address it, whether you address the national level, at a regional level, or at a level of a cluster, okay, I think that needs to be thought out in the context. I mean, they cannot be, sitting here, I'm not thinking of a universal blueprints, okay. I'm thinking, places where industrial policy has succeeded are where you found they are context specific. Okay, I mean, that's important. I think designing policy beyond some general principles has to be context specific. If you do that, I think it can work. That's my view. Thank you.
So none of the questions were kind of aimed at me, but I want to just comment on the points that kind of Sanjeev raised. And I have three thoughts, really. The first is I think that there's a great danger in us painting the world as a world which is where the kind of choices are kind of dichotomous, that it's either A or B. I think while I agree with lots of what you said around that the kind of impacts will be on skilled and unskilled, that we shouldn't necessarily always rely on history, etc. But I think the kind of reality of it is that we kind of dealing with a much more complex problem than that. And while we do require analysis that would be agile and where we can adapt and change, I do think that kind of economic analysis based on lots of our kind of accepted theories also have a place in the debate. We don't have to kind of hang on to them all of the time, but I think a kind of a view that there's no place for sort of policy, because we're in such a chaotic world, that we should just kind of respond on the hoof without deep analysis from theory, etc. I think is kind of painting a world that's not the reality that I see. The kind of second point is kind of really one that I made in the talk, that I find that a lot of the conversations about the fourth industrial revolution simply do not deal with the realities of the labor market that we have to confront, and I think there's a real need for that. The third was just a point on kind of education and its role. I'm a firm as a dean of a commerce faculty. I'm a firm believer that we should have much closer relationships to kind of industry, but I also think that we must be very open to some of the dangers of pushing that too far. Now, if we think about what are the types of things that we're going to have to deal with through the fourth industrial revolution, so just say we do get to kind of driverless cars and kind of AI having to run those. Some of what's going to happen is that those cars are sort of going to have technologies that will have to make exceedingly complex philosophical and kind of ethical kind of choices. So if a crash is about to happen and you're in a world of big data, you can process whether choice A is going to kill 5 poor people or choice B is going to kill 2 extremely kind of rich people. Those are deeply ethical choices, and I think the kind of importance of kind of education that is not necessarily driven by strictly commercial interests, I think are likely to actually become much more important than they are at present. And it's our responsibility as kind of educators to make sure that happens. If we leave that to the commercial interests and to the Googles of the world, I think we'll lose the ability as democratic societies to kind of exert control over those issues, and I think we should have that control.
Yeah, since most of the questions and comments were directed at me, so let me get going. Very briefly, the point about moving from just-in-time to just-in-case, absolutely, that's the whole point of what I was talking about. The whole point about what I'm talking about is that we live in a world with radical uncertainty. And by the way, there's nothing to do with just with the fourth industrial revolution. This is always the case. Chaos theory people like myself view the world as inherently unstable and unpredictable. So this is entirely about just in case, because we see the whole world as a place where you have to think about options and flexibility and continuously have to deal with it. Since somebody also mentioned about Paris Accord and the climate, this is not an abdication of flexibility. It is not an abdication of policy making. It is about making very different kinds of policy. So let's take climate change. The idea in taking my approach would be, if facing a climate change situation, first of all, do not be dead sure how this is going to turn out. Since I actually have had experience in actually fiddling around with climate models, let me tell you, anybody who tells you very clearly exactly how many meters the sea levels are going to rise as a result of climate change has never actually fiddled around with a climate model. These are highly sensitive models. We could entirely end up with a completely different set of outcomes. We could end up with more monsoons. We may end up with less monsoons. Some part of India may have more. Some part of India may have less. We may, for a while, begin to heat up more as a planet. In fact, immediately a little bit later, tip over into having an ice age. So yes, we have destabilized our climate systems, but how do we deal with this? So just in case is a very important thing. In this environment, the key is to open out options. And that's why, while climate mitigation is important, climate adaptation is even more important from our perspective. So for example, should we increase the amount of food we produce radically in response to such a situation? No. What we do is we increase the genetic diversity of the kinds of crops we produce, because we do not know exactly which kind of climate we'll end up with, and therefore genetic diversity in this is a far better source of policy or national strength than would be the case of producing ever more food using a certain technology based on a certain forecast. So the point is, creating optionality, adaptation, that is a line of policy making which is quite different from historically how we have thought about policy making. In fact, we disliked that old style so much, we shut down the Planning Commission. Instead, we introduced the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Because the whole point about the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, from our perspective, is that since you cannot predict, you have to allow for creative destruction. And the orderly creative destruction and creating the institutions of orderly creative destruction is the way to go. I've just given you two extreme examples, but you can see the line of thought I'm going down.
So thank you all very much. There's no way I can summarize that discussion for you in the 2 minutes that I was supposed to. But I think the depth and the diversity of this discussion really reflects the enormity of the challenge and how difficult it's going to be to build a world of work which is, which is full of dignity, security, equality, and opportunity for workers across the global South and North. And eventually, as you said, it's not